Om Ajnanatinarandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshuramitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vam Purvivachan Vam Hum Bhayate Kirim Vajana Vande Shri Gurum Dinataram Vande Shri Gurudevam Tam Karunavarunalayam Yakripālavadeshena Pāmarohyamarayate Prabhupada Ki Jai. I don't have very much to say of my personal experiences with Srila Prabhupada because I didn't have very many of them. I joined late and I was very young when I joined. And so, for two reasons, I didn't get access to Srila Prabhupada very much because it was very difficult after 1975. And also I was more or less an outsider when I saw Srila Prabhupada. I only saw him once on his last trip to Los Angeles. It was actually his last visit to the West. In June of 1976, he came to Los Angeles, where I was born and raised in Los Angeles. And at that time, I was attending a private school outside of Los Angeles, a boarding school. And so I was reading Srila Prabhupada's books for a long time. I was chanting Hare Krishna and following principles outside. And whenever I could, I would visit the temple in Los Angeles. So one day, my god brother, his name was Dutta Prabhu. I don't know where he is now, but he called me up and he said that Srila Prabhupada is coming to Los Angeles very soon. And you should take advantage of this opportunity to see Srila Prabhupada because it's very rare to get the association of a pure devotee, and even 1/11th of a second association with such a devotee can benefit you in ways that are beyond imagination. And Prabhupada is getting older now, and we don't know how many times this opportunity will be there. He very strongly preached to him, and he urged me to come visit. So I decided to do that, even though I had to go through a great deal of difficulty to arrange that, because Srila Prabhupada's visit to Los Angeles was about a week or so before the end of the school year, where I was going to school. And so there were all sorts of final exams and things like that that I was taking. I was in high school at that time. To make matters more complicated, I was actually in a school play as well. I was playing a very lead role in that play. And so I had to somehow or other, many people were depending on me. Somehow or other, by Krishna's grace, I determined myself that I would see Srila Prabhupada. And I arranged to go to Los Angeles when he was there. Somehow or other, it was like all the guards in Kamsa's palace fell asleep, because I actually called my mother and told her that the school year was ending a week sooner than it was ending. And she believed me for one thing, but we also moved out of the dormitory room where I was staying, and nobody seemed to notice. I don't know how it worked out. But anyway, so I went to see Srila Prabhupada, and he was speaking in those days on the 6th canto, the Ajamila canto. And I don't actually remember very much of what he said, although later on I studied those lectures, and he was speaking about, say for example, the 13 witnesses of the living entity's activities that are described in the discussion between Vishnudutas, Yamadutas, and Ajamila. Anyway, my first impression was when I first saw Srila Prabhupada at the greeting of the deities, Sri Sri Rukmini Bharatadish. I was standing in the back of the temple room in Los Angeles. There's a balcony that faces the deities, mezzanine, and devotees, especially the ladies, used to stand up there. So Maharaj was up there also. So I had a bird's eye view of the temple room, looking down, and I saw that Srila Prabhupada came out of the temple room. The temple room in Los Angeles has the altar here, and on the right side of the altar, as you're facing it, is the doorways that go to Srila Prabhupada's rooms, which were upstairs. So those doors opened, and the curtains in front of the doors parted, and out came Srila Prabhupada, surrounded by many sannyasi disciples and servants and devotees, so many. And there were photographers in the temple room. There was somebody had put bright lights, the kind of bright lights that they use for taking professional photographs. So at exactly the same moment that the conch blew for the arati greeting the deities, and the deity doors opened, Srila Prabhupada's doors also opened, and Srila Prabhupada came out. So it was a very splendid scene. And in fact, Srila Prabhupada, when I first saw him, it was surprising because he had such a regal commanding presence. I mean, he had this visage of royalty or a demigod of some sort. In fact, he was wearing very shiny silk, and it looked as if, a saffron silk, and it looked as if he was shining, he was glowing, almost as if the sun god had walked into the room, so effulgent he was. And this is even when he's compared to the deity, standing right next to the deity, still he had this tremendous presence. At least that's what I perceived. And he came in and he offered his obeisances to the deity, as we do, and then he sat down in the Vyasa and they had Guru Puja. At that time, I was familiar with most of the practices of the temple and knew some of the songs, even though I was very new. I wasn't initiated yet. I was still a student in school. But Prabhupada's presence was so completely unlike anything or anyone I'd ever seen before that I just completely could not concentrate on anything except Srila Prabhupada. So I knew the words to the song that they were singing, but I just could not reproduce them because I was just so overwhelmed by Srila Prabhupada's appearance and by his demeanor. Everything about him was just completely stunning. And plus, when he actually began to speak on the sixth canto of Bhagavatam, his Bengali accent was also something that I had trouble with because it was just all too new to me. So I couldn't understand very much of what he said. But again, for the same reason, it was just maybe because I was young or maybe because it was just such an overwhelming experience. I couldn't really focus on what I was hearing. But I like to think that it's something about it. Anyway, so that was the general experience that I had. Other than just offering flowers and hearing from Prabhupada in the class, I never had any personal interaction with him or anything, except for one occasion at that time, during the same week that Srila Prabhupada was visiting. I was sitting on the lawn in front of the temple. In those days there was a lawn there, now it's not there any longer, but I was sitting with the same Godbrother, Shubhananda, and we were reading Chaitanya Charitamrita. This was the section about Madhavendra Puri and his devotional service regarding Sakshi Gopal. So while we were reading from Chaitanya Charitamrita, the doorways to Srila Prabhupada's outside doorways to his quarters, they opened up. And a group of sannyasis came out. There were at least half a dozen dandas and big American sannyasis, and within the midst of them was this small, frail Bengali gentleman, Srila Prabhupada. He just was not physically comparable to his disciples, who were big, strong, young American boys. But he had this strength about him and this powerful presence about him that he just dominated the entire scene. And he had this effulgence again. Anyway, so a limousine pulled up in the alleyway next to his door, and they got into this limousine. So as they did that, Shubhananda Prabhu told me that, it's too bad we don't have any flowers, otherwise we could offer Srila Prabhupada some flowers. And as soon as I heard the word flowers, my eyes fixed on some marigolds that were growing in the flower bed there near the temple. So I didn't even ask any questions. I just picked a handful of flowers, and I walked right up to the limousine, which had the window open because it was early summer. And I just very boldly reached into the window and handed the flowers to Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada, I think, it seemed as if maybe he wasn't sure what my intention was, because he said something to his servant, which I didn't hear exactly, but I gathered that he told him that he wants to offer you these flowers. So Srila Prabhupada very graciously held out his hand and he took the flowers, and then the car drove off. And that was really the only direct interaction I ever had with Srila Prabhupada. Otherwise I was reading his books and I was chanting and trying to follow Krishna consciousness to the extent that I could in my circumstances. But I feel very fortunate to have at least had that much association, as he told me that the 1/11th of a second of a pure devotee can plant something in your heart that will not die, will only increase. And I hope by Srila Prabhupada's grace it will work on that. I got initiated much later when I joined the Radha Damodar traveling Sankirtan party eventually. Because at this time I was only maybe 14 or 15. And you weren't allowed to join the temple at that age. And there were actually two wings of devotees in the temple at that time. There was the right-wing devotees, who were headed by, I think it was Damodar Prabhu. In those days he was a brahmachari. And he was in charge of the newly formed Bhakta program. And he was very clear about that. And he said that Prabhupada told me that he empowered me to do this service. And so I'm your authority, and you have to follow the rules that we set for you. And he advised that just stay home and follow the principles, and gradually when you graduate, you get old enough, you become of legal age, then you can join the temple. So those were the right wing devotees. And then meanwhile there was an underground wing, the left wing devotees. And they were headed by the temple commander, whose name I probably should not mention. But he instead was saying that, no, just leave, just join now. Because you could die any minute. And Prabhupada can also leave any minute. You don't have any time to wait. You've got to do this now. And we could put you on a bus, and once you shave your head, nobody will ever recognize you. Your parents will never. So, to my immature mind in those days, this was an infinitely more appealing proposal. And I fell for it. So I actually went and tried to join the San Diego temple, and I actually was able to stay there for some time. But eventually one day, there was a car parked illegally in front of the temple. And somehow the police came to inquire about that car. And they knocked at the door, and I happened to be in the vicinity, so I answered the door. And the policeman told me about the problem. And then he looked at me in a funny way, and he said, "How old are you?" And I thought for a moment, and then I said, "I'm 18. And at that time, I probably didn't even look 15. So he said, "What?" And I said, 17. And so then he said, I think that we need to take you downtown. So he actually did that, and they called my parents, and they arranged that they put me on a plane and sent me back to Los Angeles, probably at my mother's expense. So I had a long conversation with my parents after that, and I promised that I would finish school and get a job and learn to drive and all the things that you're supposed to do when you're an American teenager. But at the same time, because I was still chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Rama, Hare, and secretly associating with devotees, this fire was not to be put out. And eventually I became consumed by the desire to join the temple again. And this time the left-wing devotees prevailed again. And they sent me on a flight to New York City in the middle of the night. And I ended up in New York City at 7 a.m. in about September of that year, when it's getting pretty cold in New York. And I didn't have any warm clothes, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't know where to go. But somehow or other, I don't know how, I just figured out how to get to the temple, and I made it to the temple, and from there at that, I was there rendering service for a few days only in Radha Govinda's Manhattan Mandir. In those days they had a temple in Manhattan. And also at that time there was a general spate of problems, PR problems, public relations problems that our movement had with young people in my category who were joining ISKCON, and bothering their parents about, that irresponsible decision. So there was, in fact, some parents were even hiring professional psychologists or, dubious characters who would deprogram their children, because the rhetoric was that we were a cult and we were brainwashing innocent young children and forcing them to move into the cult and, work for the cult and that sort of thing. So actually a lot of parents were doing that. They were pulling their children out, and there were court cases going on, and I was unaware of all this at the time, but it turned out to be a pretty hot situation. So I think the temple authorities probably decided that they should send me somewhere less public than Manhattan. And so they sent me to this farm community in Pennsylvania that Srila Prabhupada later or maybe next year I think it was, he renamed. In those days when I joined it was called Varshana. And then Prabhupada later on renamed it. It's now known as Gitanagari. So I was there picking potatoes in the fall of 1976 in Gitanagari, what was become Gitanagari. And one day, Tamal Krishna Goswami and Guru Kripa Swami and Trishna Swami, all three came to Gitanagari. And their practice at that time was that they would go into any temple, and if they saw some brahmachari who was not thoroughly engaged and not deeply absorbed in his engagement, they would try to convince him to join the Radha Damodar travel in some kirtan party. So that's what they did with me. And then I joined that party, and that's just really was. So eventually, because after I had been in the movement for some months, they discussed initiation. So I was initiated by Srila Prabhupada in absentia the next year early in Mayapur. And the beads were sent, and they were given to me, I think, by Krishna Swami. And I was initiated along with several others. Most of them are gone now. Chandra Maharaj was one of them. He's also gone.